Most people don't suffer because they are weak. They suffer because they don't know their worth. They keep over-explaining themselves, overgiving their time and energy, overstaying in situations that drain them, and over-tolerating behavior that diminishes them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they disappear not physically, but psychologically. They lose themselves in the process, forgetting who they truly are. The world doesn't lower your value. You do the moment you start accepting less than you deserve. Understanding your worth is not arrogance. It's awareness. It's emotional intelligence. It's psychological strength. When you fail to define your value, someone else will, and they will always define it lower than it actually is. This isn't just motivation or empty words. This is psychological truth. The moment you recognize your own value, the moment you stop settling for less, you reclaim your life, your mind, and your power. And that's where real strength begins. Not knowing your own worth does not destroy you in one dramatic moment. It erodes you slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it feels like patience. Then it feels like understanding. Then it feels like sacrifice. But over time, it becomes self-abandonment. The psychological damage of not knowing your worth does not begin with others disrespecting you. It begins with you tolerating what does not align with your value. Every time you accept behavior that makes you uncomfortable but say nothing, your brain registers a dangerous message. This is acceptable. The human mind is adaptive. Whatever you repeatedly tolerate, you normalize. And once something becomes normal, it no longer feels wrong, even if it is hurting you. When you are disconnected from your worth, you start negotiating with standards you once believed were non-negotiable. You allow small dismissals. You laugh off subtle insults. You justify inconsistency. You explain away emotional unavailability. Not because you are foolish, but because deep down, you are uncertain. Uncertain about whether you deserve better. Uncertain about whether better even exists for you. That uncertainty is where the psychological damage begins. Self-worth is not just confidence. It is the internal measurement system that tells you what you deserve. When that system is weak, your boundaries weaken with it. Low self-worth creates hyper-awareness of others and under-awareness of yourself. You begin scanning the room for approval instead of checking in with your own comfort. You ask, do they like me? Instead of asking, do I feel respected? This shift in focus may seem small, but it changes your entire psychological position. Instead of being centered, you become externally anchored. Your mood depends on someone's tone. Your confidence depends on someone's response time. Your peace depends on someone's validation. And when your emotional state depends on external reactions, you are no longer in control of it. The most dangerous part is that this process feels normal. You convince yourself that being understanding is maturity, that being patient is strength, that overgiving is love. But when giving becomes a strategy to secure acceptance, it is no longer generosity, it is fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being alone. And fear-driven behavior slowly reshapes your personality. You become quieter about your needs. You become quicker to apologize. You become more tolerant of things that once would have bothered you. Not because you have grown stronger, but because you have grown unsure. Psychologically, when you repeatedly suppress your discomfort, your brain learns to disconnect you from it. You stop recognizing red flags. You stop trusting your intuition. You start doubting your reactions. You tell yourself you are overthinking, too sensitive, too demanding. And this self-doubt becomes internalized. The damage deepens because now it is not just others minimizing you. You are minimizing yourself. Every time you silence your instincts to maintain harmony, you weaken your self-trust. And self-trust is the foundation of self. Without it, you are constantly second-guessing your perceptions. Another hidden effect of not knowing your worth is overcompensation. When you do not feel inherently valuable, you try to prove your value. You become the helper, the fixer, the peacemaker, the one who always shows up. On the surface, this looks admirable, but underneath, it is often driven by a subconscious belief. If I am useful, I will not be abandoned. So you attach your worth to performance, to productivity, to how much you can offer. The problem is that performance-based worth is unstable. The moment you are tired, unavailable, or imperfect, you feel replaceable. And that fear keeps you overextending yourself beyond healthy limits. Over time, emotional exhaustion sets in. You feel drained but cannot explain why. You feel unseen but hesitate to speak. You feel resentful but guilty for feeling that way. This internal conflict is psychologically heavy. You are giving more than you are receiving. But because you do not firmly believe you deserve more, you do not demand balance. Instead, you lower your expectations. You tell yourself not to expect too much. You convince yourself that this is just how relationships are. But deep down, something feels off. That quiet dissatisfaction is your worth trying to resurface. Not knowing your worth also makes you hypersensitive to rejection. When someone pulls away, your mind does not think, maybe this is not aligned. It thinks, what did I do wrong? You internalize distance. You personalize inconsistency. You assume responsibility for other people's emotional fluctuations. This creates anxiety patterns. You overanalyze messages. You replay conversations. You search for mistakes. The psychological damage here is subtle but severe. You begin seeing yourself as the common denominator in every problem. And once that belief forms, it becomes difficult to challenge. There is also a behavioral shift that occurs. You start shrinking. You tone down your opinions. You reduce your standards. You avoid confrontation at all costs. You choose temporary comfort over long-term respect. Shrinking feels safer because it reduces the risk of rejection. But shrinking also reduces your presence. And when you consistently make yourself smaller to fit into situations, you start feeling invisible within them. This invisibility breeds resentment. You want to be valued, but you are not fully showing yourself. The irony is painful. You hide parts of yourself to be accepted, then feel unaccepted because you are unseen. The longer this pattern continues, the more it affects your identity. You start defining yourself through others' reactions. If they are warm, you feel worthy. If they are distant, you feel inadequate. Your emotional stability becomes fragile because it is externally controlled. And when your self-worth is externally controlled, you become vulnerable to manipulation. People can sense when someone doubts their own value. They may not consciously realize it, but they feel it in your energy. And energy communicates before words do. When you approach life unsure of your worth, others respond accordingly. Perhaps the most damaging consequence is self-betrayal. Every time you ignore a boundary violation, you betray yourself. Every time you stay silent about something that hurt you, you betray yourself. Every time you accept less than what you internally desire, you betray yourself. These betrayals accumulate, and eventually, you no longer feel aligned with yourself. You feel disconnected, confused, lost. You wonder why your confidence has faded. But confidence cannot survive repeated self-abandonment. Knowing your worth does not mean thinking you are superior. It means recognizing that your needs, feelings, and standards are valid. When you do not recognize that, you unconsciously teach others not to recognize it either. People learn how to treat you by observing what you tolerate. If you tolerate inconsistency, they give you inconsistency. If you tolerate disrespect disguised as humor, they continue it. Not always out of malice, but out of conditioning. You are always teaching others your value, either by enforcing it or by discounting it. The psychological damage of not knowing your worth is cumulative. It builds quietly through small compromises. It grows through unspoken disappointments. It strengthens through repeated self. And by the time you recognize it, you may feel deeply depleted. But awareness is powerful. The moment you begin noticing these patterns, you interrupt them. You start questioning why you accept certain behaviors. You start observing how often you silence yourself. You begin reconnecting with the discomfort you once ignored. That discomfort is not weakness, it is guidance. At its core, not knowing your worth creates instability. You become adaptable to environments that do not deserve you. You become flexible with standards that should be firm. You become patient with patterns that require boundaries. And this instability affects your decisions. You stay longer than you should. You try harder than necessary. You forgive without change. All because you are not anchored in your value. But here is the truth. Your worth does not increase when someone chooses you. It does not decrease when someone leaves. It is not dependent on applause, attention, or approval. It exists independently of external validation. The damage happens when you forget that. When you start outsourcing your value to others. When you wait for confirmation instead of standing in certainty. The hidden psychological damage of not knowing your worth is not just about how others treat you. It is about how you treat yourself in response. It is about the standards you lower, the silence you maintain, the needs you suppress. It is about the gradual shift from self-respect to self-neglect. And until you recognize this shift, it continues silently. Awareness is the first repair. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You begin noticing where you overgive, where you where you overstay. And instead of judging yourself, you understand yourself. Because low self-worth is not a personality flaw. It is often a learned pattern. And learned patterns can be unlearned. But it begins here by acknowledging the damage. By recognizing that tolerating less has cost you more than you realized. By understanding that self-worth is not optional for emotional stability. It is foundational. Without it, you drift. With it, you anchor. And anchoring yourself is the first step toward living differently. Because once you are anchored, you begin to see clearly what you previously tolerated blindly. You start recognizing where you accepted less than you deserved, but because it felt good, but because it felt familiar. Accepting less is rarely about ignorance. It is usually about conditioning. Somewhere along the way, you learned that maintaining connection was more important than maintaining standards. You learned that being chosen was more important than being respected. And without realizing it, you began prioritizing attachment over alignment. When self-worth is unstable, fear becomes the decision maker. Not loud fear, not dramatic fear, subtle fear. The fear of being alone. The fear of starting over. The fear that this might be the best you can get. That quiet thought, maybe this is enough, has convinced many people to remain in situations that slowly diminish them. Scarcity thinking distorts perception. It makes you believe options are limited. It convinces you that walking away means losing everything. Instead of understanding, it might mean protecting yourself. Scarcity mindset is powerful because it feels logical. You tell yourself relationships are hard to find. Opportunities are rare. Good people are limited. So you compromise. You tolerate inconsistency because consistency seems too much to ask for. You accept half effort because full effort feels unrealistic. You reduce your expectations to avoid disappointment. But lowering expectations does not protect you from pain. It only guarantees dissatisfaction. Accepting less often begins with rationalization. You explain away behavior that doesn't sit right with you. You say they're busy, they're stressed, they didn't mean it. You become skilled at creating excuses for others while dismissing your own discomfort. And every time you rationalize instead of addressing, you reinforce the belief that your standards are flexible. Over time, this flexibility becomes fragility. Your boundaries weaken, your tolerance increases, and your needs quietly move to the background. There is also a psychological attachment to potential. When you don't know your worth fully, you fall in love with what something could be instead of what it is. You focus on glimpses of effort instead of patterns of neglect. You hold on to rare moments of clarity and ignore consistent confusion. Potential feels hopeful. Reality feels confronting. And hope can be addictive when you are afraid of loss. Fear of loss is deeply tied to identity. If you define your value by who stays, then someone leaving feels like proof that you were not enough. So instead of risking that interpretation, you hold on tighter. You overextend. You overcompensate. You try to become easier, calmer, more understanding. But self-abandonment does not secure connection. It only delays confrontation. And delayed confrontation always returns stronger. Another reason you accept less is familiarity. The mind prefers what it recognizes, even if it is unhealthy. If you grew up equating love with inconsistency, chaos may feel normal. If validation was conditional, you may unconsciously chase conditional approval. Familiar discomfort feels safer than unfamiliar stability. So when something steady appears, it feels suspicious. When something unstable appears, it feels exciting. Without realizing it, you repeat what you know rather than choosing what is better. Accepting less also protects you from accountability. Demanding more requires courage. It requires stating standards clearly. It requires risking rejection. And when your self-worth is still stabilizing, that risk feels overwhelming. It feels easier to stay quiet than to say, "This doesn't work for me." But silence has consequences. Every unspoken boundary teaches someone that the behavior is acceptable. And every unspoken need teaches you that your needs are optional. Over time, resentment grows. Quietly, subtly, you begin feeling unappreciated. Yet you never clearly expressed what appreciation looks like for you. You feel overlooked, yet you minimized your own presence. This internal contradiction creates emotional confusion. You are upset, but you feel guilty for being upset. You want more, but you feel demanding for wanting it. This guilt keeps you small. It convinces you that standards equal selfishness. But standards are not selfish. They are structural. Without them, relationships collapse into imbalance. When you accept less than you deserve, imbalance becomes normal. You give more, You initiate more. You care more. And at first, you tell yourself it's fine because you are strong enough to handle it. But strength without reciprocity leads to depletion. You cannot pour endlessly without feeling empty. There is also ego hidden within accepting less. Not arrogant ego, but protective ego. Sometimes you stay because leaving would mean admitting you tolerated something beneath you. It would mean acknowledging that you compromised too much. So you stay to avoid confronting that reality. Pride keeps you invested in situations that no longer align. You convince yourself that effort will eventually change things, because accepting that it won't feels like failure. But staying where you are undervalued does not prove loyalty. It proves fear, and fear disguised as loyalty keeps you stuck. Real loyalty does not require shrinking. Real connection does not require constant proving. When you know your worth, you understand that consistency is not too much to expect. Clarity is not too much to request. Respect is not too much to demand. The belief that it is too much comes from a history of settling. Breaking the pattern requires discomfort. It requires tolerating temporary loneliness instead of long-term dissatisfaction. It requires sitting with the anxiety that comes from change. When you stop accepting less, you will initially feel exposed. You will question your decisions. You will wonder if you were too harsh. But discomfort during growth is not a sign of wrongness. It is a sign of recalibration. You must also redefine what loss means. Losing someone who does not meet your standards is not loss. It is alignment. Losing access to environments that diminish you is not failure. It is self-protection. When you shift this perspective, courage becomes easier. Walking away becomes clearer. Standards become non-negotiable rather than optional. Accepting less thrives in silence and fear. It weakens in clarity and self-trust. As your anchor strengthens, your tolerance for misalignment decreases. You no longer negotiate with bare minimum effort. You no longer romanticize inconsistency. You no longer interpret confusion as depth. You see things as they are, not as you hope they could become. And that clarity changes your decisions. You pause before overgiving. You question before You observe before attaching. Not from coldness, but from awareness. You begin choosing situations that reflect your value instead of challenging it. You stop trying to earn positions you already deserve. The moment you truly understand that accepting less has been a reflection of fear, not reality, you reclaim control. You realize options expand when standards rise. You recognize that self-respect filters out what self-doubt once entertained. And slowly, the urge to settle weakens, because you are no longer anchored in scarcity. You are anchored in worth. When you are anchored in worth, your focus begins to shift in a way that is subtle but powerful. You stop scanning for approval and start evaluating alignment. Approval asks, am I enough for them? Alignment asks, is this right for me? That single shift restructures your internal dialogue. For a long time, you may have shaped yourself around external expectations, adjusting your tone, your preferences, even your personality to maintain acceptance. But once worth becomes your anchor, you no longer feel the need to edit yourself for comfort. You become more honest, not louder, not harsher, just clearer. Seeking approval is exhausting because it requires constant performance. You monitor reactions. You analyze expressions. You measure pauses in conversation. You adapt in real time to avoid disapproval. It becomes a quiet obsession, being liked, being chosen, being validated. But approval is unstable currency. It fluctuates based on mood, context, and perception. If your worth depends on it, your emotional state will always feel fragile. Anchored worth changes that you begin to realize that not everyone needs to understand you. Not everyone needs to choose you. And most importantly, not everyone qualifies for access to you. Alignment feels different from approval. It feels steady. It feels grounded. Instead of chasing chemistry, you assess consistency. Instead of being impressed by intensity, you look for stability. Instead of interpreting mixed signals as complexity, you recognize them as incompatibility. This clarity reduces emotional chaos. You no longer romanticize confusion. You no longer interpret unpredictability as depth. You understand that real value does not require decoding. As this shift deepens, you begin asking better questions. Not how do I keep this, but does this respect me? Not how do I make them stay, but do I even want this to stay? These questions are powerful because they reposition you from applicant to evaluator. You stop auditioning for roles in other people's lives and start evaluating who earns roles in yours. That transition feels unfamiliar at first. You may experience guilt. You may worry you are becoming distant or detached. But what is actually happening is stabilization. Your standards are becoming internal rather than reactive. Alignment also demands. You cannot pursue alignment if you do not know yourself. So you begin observing your emotional responses more honestly. You notice what drains you. You notice what energizes you. You notice when you feel respected and when you feel diminished. Instead of dismissing these signals, you honor them. Self-trust strengthens in this process. And as self-trust strengthens, indecision weakens. You stop doubting your discomfort. You stop overriding your instincts to maintain harmony. One of the clearest signs that you are moving from approval to alignment is how you handle disagreement. When approval drives you, disagreement feels threatening. It feels like rejection. So you soften your opinions. You avoid conflict. You agree outwardly while disagreeing internally. But when worth anchors you, disagreement becomes information rather than danger. You can hold your perspective without hostility. You can listen without collapsing your own stance. You understand that compatibility is not built on sameness. It is built on mutual respect. Another shift occurs in how you interpret distance. Previously, distance may have triggered anxiety. You might have assumed something was wrong. You might have rushed to repair, clarify, or chase. But alignment reframes distance as data. If someone pulls away, you observe instead of pursuing. You evaluate patterns instead of panicking. You understand that consistency speaks louder than promises. This calm observation prevents emotional overinvestment in unstable dynamics. As alignment becomes your priority, your relationships begin to change. Some connections will fade naturally, not because you became cold, but because you became clear. Clarity disrupts dynamics that relied on your flexibility. People who benefited from your overextension may resist your steadiness. They may describe you as different. And they are right. You are different. You are no longer negotiating with your own value to preserve comfort. This transformation also affects how you approach opportunities. You stop saying yes out of fear of missing out. You stop committing from obligation alone. You ask whether environments align with your standards, not just whether they validate your abilities. You recognize that access to you is not automatic. It is intentional. Your time, energy, and presence carry weight now. You distribute them carefully. Emotionally, you feel more stable. Not because everything around you is perfect, but because your internal compass is stronger. When situations do not align, you feel it immediately. And instead of rationalizing it away, you respond accordingly. Sometimes that response is a conversation. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is distance. But it is always rooted in self-respect rather than fear. Alignment also reduces the need for explanation. When you were seeking approval, you likely over-explained your decisions to avoid misunderstanding. You wanted everyone comfortable. Now, you accept that not everyone will understand your boundaries. And that is fine. Understanding is welcome, but it is not required. You no longer measure the validity of your choices by the agreement of others. This stage requires patience. The habit of seeking approval does not disappear instantly. There will be moments when you feel the old pull, the urge to overgive, to overclarify, to overstay. But awareness interrupts repetition. You pause. You question. You choose differently. And with each different choice, your alignment strengthens. You also begin recognizing that alignment is mutual. It is not about demanding perfection from others. It is about shared standards. You are not seeking control. You are seeking reciprocity. You are not expecting you are expecting effort. When someone shows consistent respect, your energy matches naturally. When they do not, you withdraw without drama. Not as punishment, as protection. The most profound change is internal. You feel less reactive, less desperate, less uncertain. You do not rush emotional closeness. You allow connections to reveal themselves over time. You understand that real value unfolds gradually. Urgency fades. Clarity increases. And in that clarity, you feel lighter. Alignment is not about isolating yourself. It is about filtering wisely. It is about recognizing that compatibility enhances worth, while misalignment erodes it. As you continue choosing alignment over approval, your environment begins reflecting your standards. The chaos reduces. The confusion lessens. The need to prove diminishes. And what replaces it is calm confidence. Not loud, not performative, just steady. A quiet understanding that your worth is not up for negotiation, that your presence is not conditional, that your standards are not excessive. They are reflective of someone who no longer settles to avoid emptiness, reflective of someone who understands that alignment is not found by shrinking, but by standing fully, consistently, and without apology in their own value. Standing fully in your value inevitably leads to one unavoidable requirement: boundaries. Without boundaries, alignment collapses. Without boundaries, worth becomes a concept instead of a practice. It is easy to say you know your worth. It is much harder to protect it when tested. Boundaries are the evidence that your self-worth is real. A boundary is not aggression. It is not control. It is not punishment. It is clarity about what you will and will not accept. When you truly know your worth, you understand that access to you is not automatic. Your time, energy, emotional availability, and presence are not public resources. They are valuable assets, and valuable things are protected. For a long time, you may have associated boundaries with loss. You may have believed that setting limits pushes people away. In reality, boundaries do not push the right people away. They filter the wrong ones out. People who respect you will adjust. people who benefited from your lack of limits will resist. That resistance is information, not a signal to retreat, but a signal to reinforce. When self-worth is unstable, boundaries feel uncomfortable. You worry about being perceived as difficult. You soften your limits. You add excessive explanations. You apologize for needing space. You negotiate your non-negotiables. But anchored worth removes the need for overexplaining. You begin to understand that clarity does not require justification. "This doesn't work for me" becomes a complete sentence. Boundaries protect more than your time. They protect your nervous system. When you repeatedly tolerate behavior that feels wrong, your body registers stress, even if your mind rationalizes it. You feel tension, irritation, fatigue. These signals are not random. They are indicators of violated standards. When you ignore them, stress accumulates. When you address them, stability returns. There are different forms of boundaries, and each one reflects a deeper layer of self-worth. Emotional boundaries prevent you from absorbing responsibilities that are not yours. You stop carrying other people's moods as if they are obligations. You listen, but you do not internalize. You support, but you do not rescue. You understand the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. Time boundaries shift your priorities. You no longer overcommit to avoid disappointing others. You evaluate whether requests align with your capacity. You understand that saying yes to everything is not generosity. When you value yourself, you respect your limits. Rest becomes necessary, not optional. Space becomes healthy, not selfish. Communication boundaries require courage. They require expressing discomfort early instead of storing resentment. When something feels misaligned, you address it calmly. Not to attack, but to clarify. If the response is defensive or dismissive, you observe rather than argue. Boundaries are not debates. They are decisions. One of the hardest boundaries to establish is consistency. When someone shows you who they are through repeated behavior, believing them is a boundary. Not giving endless chances for potential to appear. Not waiting for patterns to transform without evidence. Self-worth recognizes that consistency is a standard, not a bonus. You may notice that as your boundaries strengthen, certain dynamics weaken. Relationships built on your over-flexibility struggle with your firmness. People accustomed to your silence feel challenged by your clarity. This phase can feel isolating. But isolation during growth is temporary. What remains after filtering is stronger, more stable, more aligned. Boundaries also reshape your self-perception. Each time you enforce one, your self-trust increases. You prove to yourself that your comfort matters, that your standards are valid, that your needs are not excessive. This reinforcement builds confidence organically. Not performative confidence, but grounded assurance. It is important to understand that boundaries do not eliminate discomfort entirely. There will still be moments of doubt. You may question whether you were too firm, too distant, too direct. But doubt does not mean you were wrong. It means you are adjusting to a new standard. Growth feels unfamiliar before it feels natural. Another essential truth is that boundaries must be consistent to be respected. Inconsistent enforcement confuses both you and others. If you tolerate something one day and reject it the next without explanation, instability returns. Consistency communicates seriousness. It reinforces that your worth is steady, not conditional. You also learn that boundaries are internal before they are external. It is not only about what you allow from others, It is about what you allow from yourself. You stop overextending to earn validation. You stop re-entering spaces that repeatedly diminish you. You stop negotiating with red flags because loneliness feels uncomfortable. Internal boundaries prevent self-betrayal. The more you protect your value, the calmer you become. Chaos decreases because you are no longer entertaining misalignment. Drama reduces because you are no longer reacting impulsively. You observe, decide, and respond with intention. Your energy feels contained instead of scattered. Boundaries do not make you rigid. They make you stable. Stability is attractive not because it demands attention, but because it radiates certainty. People feel secure around those who know where they stand. Ambiguity fades. Mixed signals lose access. Clarity becomes your standard language. There is also strength in accepting the consequences of your boundaries. Some people will leave. Some opportunities will disappear. But what leaves due to your standards was never sustainable. Holding on to it would have required shrinking. And you have already moved beyond shrinking. As boundaries become integrated into your behavior, you no longer need to announce them dramatically. They are reflected in your choices, in what you tolerate, in what you decline, in how quickly you disengage from disrespect. Your actions speak before explanations are required. You begin to see boundaries not as walls, but as alignment tools. They ensure that what enters your life matches your standards. They prevent emotional depletion. They reinforce that your worth is not theoretical, it is operational, and with each boundary you maintain, your internal anchor strengthens further. You trust yourself more. You respect yourself more. You require less validation because your standards validate you. The need to prove fades. The need to protect remains, because knowing your worth without boundaries is fragile. But knowing your worth and enforcing it consistently transforms your life from reactive to intentional, from anxious to steady, from uncertain to assured. And once your worth is protected consistently, you no longer fear losing what cannot respect it. That absence of fear changes how you live. You move differently. You decide differently. You attach differently. Not because you have become detached from emotion, but because you are no longer driven by the anxiety of abandonment. When worth is secure, desperation dissolves. You are no longer trying to secure permanence at the cost of peace. You are choosing quality over proximity, depth over intensity, stability over stimulation. Living as someone who knows their worth means you stop forcing outcomes. You understand that what is aligned will remain without manipulation. You no longer overtext to maintain interest. You no longer overexplain to prevent misunderstanding. You no longer overextend to secure relevance. Effort becomes mutual or it becomes absent. There is no middle space where you carry what should be shared. This shift is visible in your patience. You do not rush connection. You allow time to reveal character. You observe consistency before investing deeply. You understand that attraction is easy, but alignment is rare. And because you value yourself, you are willing to wait for alignment. Waiting no longer feels like deprivation. It feels like discernment. Discernment becomes one of your strongest traits. You read actions more than words. You notice patterns rather than promises. You pay attention to how you feel after interactions, energized or drained, respected or diminished, clear or confused. These emotional indicators guide your decisions. You trust them. You no longer override discomfort just to maintain access to someone. Confidence at this stage, is quiet. It does not seek attention. It does not compete. It does not compare. Comparison weakens when worth stabilizes. You no longer measure yourself against others to determine value. You recognize that worth is not a ranking system. It is internal alignment. Someone else's success does not threaten yours. Someone else's preference does not invalidate you. Rejection becomes redirection rather than humiliation. You also stop trying to be universally liked. You accept that not everyone will resonate with you, and that acceptance feels freeing. When you were seeking approval, disapproval felt personal. Now it feels neutral. Compatibility is selective, and selectivity protects value. You would rather be respected by a few than approved by many. Living in your worth also changes how you handle mistakes. You no longer interpret every error as evidence of inadequacy. You correct without collapsing. You learn without labeling yourself as failure, because your worth is not tied to perfection. It is tied to integrity. As long as you act in alignment with your standards, you remain steady. There is also an ease in your boundaries now. They are not forced. They are integrated. You decline invitations without guilt when necessary. You disengage from conversations that cross lines. You communicate needs without trembling. And when someone cannot meet those needs, you accept it without trying to reshape yourself into something more convenient. Your energy becomes intentional. You invest where effort is reciprocated. You nurture what nurtures you. You give without keeping score, but only where giving feels natural, not strategic. Overgiving disappears because you no longer equate sacrifice with love. Love, to you now, includes respect. It includes clarity. It includes safety. You may notice that your circle becomes smaller, but it becomes stronger. Interactions feel lighter. There is less drama, less confusion, less emotional volatility. Stability replaces chaos. Not because life is perfect, but because you no longer entertain instability for the sake of attachment. Another transformation appears in solitude. Being alone no longer feels like absence. It feels like space. You use it to recalibrate, to reflect, to strengthen. Loneliness loses its threat because you are comfortable with your own presence. When you enjoy your own company, you are less likely to tolerate company that diminishes you. Your decisions become rooted in long-term alignment rather than short-term emotion. You consider whether situations support your growth, whether environments reflect your standards, whether relationships contribute to peace rather than pressure. You choose slowly, intentionally, and that intentionality reduces regret. Living in your worth also means forgiving yourself for past settling. You no longer judge who you were when your standards were unclear. You understand that awareness evolves, that growth requires experience. Instead of shame, you feel gratitude for the lessons that strengthened your discernment. There is strength in your silence now. You do not respond to every provocation. You do not chase closure where clarity has already been provided through behavior. You recognize when explanation is unnecessary, and that restraint communicates confidence more loudly than argument ever could. As you continue living from worth, attraction changes too. You are drawn to stability rather than intensity. You appreciate calm rather than chaos. You recognize that healthy dynamics feel steady, not dramatic. And because you are steady within yourself, you no longer crave emotional roller coasters to feel connected. Most importantly, you trust your capacity to walk away if necessary. That trust eliminates fear. And without fear, your presence becomes powerful, not intimidating. People sense when someone does not need them to feel whole. That independence shifts dynamics naturally. Respect increases. Manipulation decreases. Because you are no longer available for dynamics that require you to shrink. Living as someone who knows their worth does not mean you will never feel doubt again. It means doubt no longer controls you. It does not dictate your choices. It does not silence your standards. You feel it, acknowledge it, and move forward aligned anyway. And over time, this alignment compounds. Your environment reflects your standards. Your relationships mirror your Your opportunities align with your confidence. Life feels less forced and more intentional. Because knowing your worth was never about proving value to the world. It was about recognizing it within yourself and refusing to negotiate it externally. It was about anchoring so deeply in your standards that external fluctuations cannot destabilize you. And when you live from that anchor consistently, worth is no longer something you search for. It becomes something you embody naturally, calmly, and without apology.